Hello, my name is Gerald Wilson. I'm with Peak Truck Driving School at Maryville, Tennessee. Today what we're going to do is go over Form A. We will not be covering coupling in Form A. Coupling is in Form A, Form B, and Form C. One of the first things we need to remember when we're going to do a pre-trip in the state of Tennessee, by state rules, the tractor must be chocked, which is chock in front of the driver's side tire over there. All right, another thing we have to remember when we're doing these different sections of the front of the tractor and both sides of the engine is every time we enter a new section we have to say the words overview. It is a graded word. All right, what we're going to talk about in this video are our clearance lights above the windshield, both our headlights and turn signals. We're going to check under the vehicle to make sure there's no obvious leaks. We're also going to make sure that the tractor is not leaning from one side to the other. If it's leaning to the side, it could be an issue with your suspension that you'd want to take a closer look at. All right, so here we go. The overview of the whole front of my tractor. I see nothing cracked, damaged, or loose. I see nothing leaking, and my tractor is not leaning from side to side. All of my lights, lenses, and reflectors, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose. They are the proper color, and they are clean. And that is all there is to the front of the tractor for the state test. Obviously, while we're looking at the front of the tractor, we want to make sure there's no other issues. But our main focus today is the state test for the state of Tennessee. What I'm going to do right now on the passenger side of the engine is show you the components that we'll be talking about, and then I'll back it off and show you how you should do the pre-trip. As we get on the passenger side of the engine, one of the things I want to talk about is my alternator, which is right here, and the fact that it is belt driven. I want to talk about my water pump. It is also belt driven. One of the nice things about every engine I've ever seen is that the water pump and the alternator are going to be belt driven. So if it's a different type of engine, look for the belts, and you should be able to find the articles or the items that you want to look at. Up here is our coolant reservoir. We'll talk about that as well. All right, now we're going to do the actual pre-trip part. Remember that we have to do an overview first every time we go to a new section. So the overview of the passenger side of my engine is I see nothing cracked, damaged, or loose. I see nothing leaking. All of my hoses and wires have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. Nothing is leaking, and they are pliable. My alternator, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is belt driven. My water pump, it is not cracked, damaged, loose, or leaking. It is belt driven. Now this is a point and touch test. I have pointed at the items. Now I'm going to touch an item, the belt. My belt has no more than 3/4 inch of play. It has no abrasions, bumps, or cuts, and no signs of fraying around the outer edges. My coolant reservoir, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not leaking, and it is filled to the proper operating level. And that's all it is on these Cummins ISX 15 engines, is the alternator, water pump, the belt, and the coolant reservoir. Obviously, I'm going to look at the rest of the engine and make sure I see nothing that is out of place or does not look like it should. Thank you. Well, here we are on the driver's side of the engine. Quite a few more things over here that we have to talk about. First, I'm going to show you the components that we will be talking about, then we'll do the pre-trip. I move in on the engine, and right here is my air compressor. Generally, an air compressor can be identified either by a high pressure steel braided line, or it may have a hard copper line. Down here, that silver item that I'm pointing at, that is my power steering pump. Generally, you can find it by finding the power steering reservoir and then just following the hoses back to the pump. I'm going to mention my engine oil fill cap. We're going to talk about our dipstick and how we would check our oil. Okay. We're going to talk about our leaf spring holders, front, back, and a shackle. We're going to talk about our leaf spring. We're going to talk about our bump stop and our 2 U-bolts. We're going to talk about our shock and the shock mounts. We'll come back up here and talk about our power steering reservoir, the hoses. We'll talk about our power steering gearbox and the mounting. We'll talk about the 1, 2, 3 pieces of our steering linkage and the castle nuts, which keep them locked in place. We'll talk about our brake hose and our ABS wire, our brake chamber, our push rod, our slack adjuster. Let me see if I can get this thing turned around where y'all can see. I'm going to talk about my brake drum, my brake padding, the inside of my wheel or rim, the inside of my tire. We'll talk about the top of the tire, the outside sidewall. We'll talk about the rim again if we have to. We'll talk about our lug nuts, our wheel hub, and our valve stem down here. All right, let's get ready to do the pre-trip. All right, we're getting ready to do the driver's side of the engine on our Form A. Remember, the first thing we have to do is the overview. So the overview, with the whole front of my engine here on the driver's side, I see nothing cracked, damaged, or loose. I see nothing leaking. All of my hoses and wires, they have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. Nothing is leaking and they are pliable. My air compressor and my power steering pump, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose. They are not leaking and they are gear driven. I do have to mention what makes them work, so they are gear driven. My hoses going to both of those items have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. Nothing is leaking and they are pliable. My engine oil fill cap, it is on, it is secure. My dipstick, I would not actually pull it out on the pre-trip. I would just show the examiner how I would do it. So I would pull my dipstick out, I would wipe it clean, I would put it back in, I would pull it back out, I would read it, I would put it back in, and it is secure. All right, we'll get down here and go ahead and do my suspension next. My front leaf spring hanger, my rear leaf spring hanger, and my shackle, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose. My leaf spring, my U-bolts, and my bump stop, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose. Signs of looseness on the U-bolts would be shiny metal or metal shavings. My shock, my upper shock mount, my lower shock mount, and my shock are not cracked, damaged, or loose, and the shock has no signs of leaking. That's all for suspension. Now what I'm going to do is my steering. My power steering reservoir is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not leaking, and it is filled to the proper operating levels. All of the hoses have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. They are not leaking, and they are pliable. My power steering gearbox, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not leaking, and it is properly mounted to the frame of the tractor with nuts and bolts, and they are tight. The 1, 2, 3 pieces of my steering linkage, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose, and they are secure with 1, 2 castle nuts and coulter pins, and they are tight. And that is all we have to do for suspension. Now we're going to do our braking. I always start my braking off at my hoses. So my air hose and my ABS wire, they have no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. Nothing is leaking, and they are pliable. My brake chamber, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not dented. It is not leaking, and it is secured with a chamber ring and or a V-clamp. My push rod and my slack adjuster, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose, and they are secure with pins and C-clamps. Here's another thing you're going to act out for your examiner. With my brakes released and my wheels chopped, I cannot pull my slack adjuster more than 1 inch. All right, we'll look inside. My brake drum and my brake pads, they are not cracked, damaged, or loose. There's no signs of oil or grease, and I have at least 1/4 inch of padding on my brake pads. And that's all there is for brakes. Now I'm going to cover the tire and the wheel out here. My inner and outer rim or wheel is not cracked, damaged, or loose. There's no signs of oil or grease, and there's no signs of illegal welds. My inside and outside sidewall, I see no abrasions, bumps, or cuts, and they are both seated properly to the rim. The top of my tire, I see no uneven wear. I see no abrasions, bumps, or cuts. I have at least a minimum of 4/32 of tread depth, and this must be a virgin radial tire. It cannot be a recap. When I move out here, my lug nuts, none are missing. They're not cracked, damaged, or loose. Signs of looseness would be shiny metal, metal shavings, or rust streaks coming out from behind the nuts. My center wheel hub, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not leaking, and it is filled to the proper operating levels. And my valve stem, it is not cracked, damaged, or loose. It is not leaking, and I have at least 100 pounds of pressure in this tire, and I would check that with a tire gauge. And that is all of Form A minus the coupling. Coupling is in Form A, Form B, and Form C. Coupling will be coming at a later date. I hope this helps. Peak Technical Institute, Maryville, Tennessee. If you get a chance to come see us, please do. Thank you.